We assume while fitting linear model that there is normality of errors. In other words, the error terms in the linear model are normally distributed. And we also assume that the error terms are not correlated to each other and that they are homoscedastic, which means the variances of the error terms are equal. Sometimes one or more of these assumptions are violated. When we violate the assumption that the error terms are normally distributed, or when the relationship between the dependent and independent variables in case of a linear model are not linear, in that case we need to make some transformation to straighten out the problem. In this module, we will learn about one such transformation, namely the Box-Cox transformation, which is one of the foremost transformation methods used to take care of these assumption violations. As I have mentioned in the introduction, in this module we will discuss the Box-Cox transformation of variables before fitting a linear model to the data. But the question here is, why do we wish to transform the data that we have? The first and foremost assumption that we make before fitting a linear model is that the relationship between the response variable y or the dependent variable y and the explanatory variables or the predictor variables x's is linear. However, this is not the case sometimes. So when the relationship between the dependent and independent variable is not linear and we still wish to fit a linear model to the data, then we can consider a few transformation of either the predictor variables or the response variable, and then fit a linear model to the data to study the effect that the predictor variable has on the transformed responses. So our main concern for transforming a data set is that the linear least square regression assumes that the relationship between the two variables is linear. However, often when the relationship is nonlinear, it can be straightened out by transforming one or both variables. One other very important assumption of linear model is that the error terms are normally distributed, and the distribution is with mean 0 and variance sigma square times in, where in is an identity matrix of order n. We also know that the response variable y has an expected value of x times beta, where beta is the vector of parameters, and the variance of y is sigma square in, just like the variance of the error terms, because we assume that x's and the error terms are uncorrelated. So another important assumption is that the errors are normally distributed, but significant violation of this assumption often leads to committing of type 1 or type 2 error. In order to counter the negative effect of non-normality of the error terms in a linear model, we sometimes seek the help of transformation of the response variable or transformation of data before fitting a model to counter the negative effect of non-normality. Now, one of the very common transformations that we consider while transforming a data is the log transformation. Although there are an infinite number of functions that can be used to transform variables, in practice we only use relatively small number of functions regularly due to the easiness of computation. One of the most commonly used transformation is the log transformation. In practice, we use the transformation log x with base e, where e equals 2.718, which is the base of natural logarithm, and it says limit of p goes to 0, x times x to the power p minus 1 divided by p equals log base e times x. A second type of common transformation that we can use is the power transformation. For variables that are quantitative, we usually rely on the family of power and root transformations. For example, we take the variable x and we raise it to the power of P, which can be considered a transformation of the variable x. When P is negative, the transformation is an inverse power transformation. For example, if P is 1, then x raised to the power of minus 1 would mean the inverse of the variable x, or in other words 1 divided by x. Or if P is negative 2, then x raised to the power of minus 2 is the transformation which is given by 1 divided by x square. When P is a fraction, however, the transformation represents a root. For example, when P takes the value half, then we can write x raised to the power of half equals square root of x, or x raised to the power of minus half equals 1 divided by square root of x. And these are some very common transformations, or power transformations rather, of the variable that we can consider if the linearity of the model or the non-normality of the error terms occur. In this module, we will mostly discuss Box-Cox transformation in detail, and this is one of the most complicated, one of the most sophisticated transformations which are very commonly used for data while fitting linear models. Box-Cox transformation was first developed by two British statisticians, namely George Box and Sir David Cox. The original form of the Box-Cox transformation is of the following form. We take the response y and we transform it to y raised to the power of lambda minus 1 divided by lambda if the parameter lambda not equals 0, and y equals log y if lambda equals 0. The aim of the Box-Cox transformation was to make sure that the assumptions of the linear model holds. That is, the response variable y follows normal distribution with mean x times beta and variance sigma square in. In another paper in 1964, Box and Cox proposed an extended form of the two-parameter Box-Cox transformation which they had proposed before. And in this paper, the form that the transformation took was y equals y plus lambda 2 raised to the power of lambda 1 minus 1 divided by lambda 1 if lambda 1 took the value, any value not equals 0, and y equals log y plus lambda 2 if lambda 1 equals 0. In practice, we tend to choose lambda 2 such that y plus lambda 2 is greater than 0 for any y. But for computational easiness, we most of the time use the first form of the Box-Cox transformation. Now, after we transform our response variable using the Box-Cox transformation, we now fit a linear model and we obtain the estimates of the parameters. But after we obtain the estimates of the parameters, we would like to work on the inferential methods on the transformation parameter lambda as well as the regression parameters involved in the linear model. The primary objective in the analysis of Box-Cox transformation model is to draw inference on the lambda used for transformation. In most cases, actually, when we fit a linear model to the data or when we fit any model to the data, our basic need is to estimate the parameters involved, and then using the estimates, we write down the model and we wish to test the validity or the significance of these estimates or of these parameters in the model. Now, here in case of Box-Cox transformation, it is no different from fitting any other model. However, in Box-Cox transformation, since we have added another extra parameter lambda, we are now very interested in drawing inference on this parameter that was used for transformation. There are basically two broad methods of discussing inference on the transformation parameter lambda. The first is the maximum likelihood method, which is the most commonly used method for estimating lambda or any other parameter involved in the model, and the second is the Bayesian method. In this module, we will only restrict ourselves to the discussion of maximum likelihood method of estimation of parameter lambda and the regression parameters involved in the model. Now, in the maximum likelihood method, what is it that we really do? This method is more commonly used in practice because it is conceptually easy and the likelihood function is easy to compute. We can also take advantage of the asymptotic properties of the MLE and find the confidence interval for lambda. Because we know the asymptotic properties of MLE, we can actually write down the distribution of the maximum likelihood estimates of the unknown parameter. And once we know the distribution with the parameters of parameter estimates, we can create or we can compute the confidence interval for the parameter involved in the model. After we have performed the Box-Cox transformation of the response variable, we assume that the response variable y is now normally distributed with mean x beta and variance sigma square in. The model parameters are now lambda, which is the transformation parameter, beta, which is the vector of regression parameter, and sigma square. The density function for y, which is the response variable, is given by exponential -1 over 2 sigma square times y lambda minus x beta prime times y lambda minus x beta divided by 2 times pi sigma square whole raised to the power of n over 2. And here we denote the responses with not just y but y lambda, because we have transformed our original responses y using the Box-Cox transformation parameter lambda, and these are the new response variable that we are using to fit the linear model. Now, assuming that j lambda y denotes the Jacobian for transforming y to y lambda, the density of y is now as the following form. This also happens to be the likelihood function for the entire model. The likelihood function now takes the form exponential -1 over 2 sigma square y lambda minus x beta prime times y lambda minus x beta divided by 2 pi sigma square whole to the power of n over 2 times j lambda y, where j lambda y is the Jacobian of transforming y to y lambda. Now, the maximum likelihood estimates of the parameters involved in this model are given by beta hat lambda equals x prime x whole inverse x times y lambda and sigma square hat lambda equals y lambda prime in minus g times y lambda divided by n, where g equals x times x prime x whole inverse x prime, or g is the projection of y on the estimated response y hat. Now, we know that to obtain the MLEs, we write down the likelihood function and we take the first order derivative of the likelihood function with respect to the unknown parameters, and we then obtain our score equations, which are equated to 0, and we solve these score equations to obtain the MLEs of the unknown parameters, and that is exactly what we have done here. So, the steps involved are: we transform using the Box-Cox transformation with parameter lambda, we transform our responses y to y lambda, and then we fit the regression model and we write down, using these transformed responses, we write down the likelihood function, and using this likelihood function we take the derivative of this likelihood function with respect to the unknown parameters beta and sigma square, and we obtain the MLEs for the two parameters. Now, we substitute the MLEs of the parameters beta lambda and sigma square lambda into the likelihood equation, because we still have to obtain the estimates of the transformation parameter lambda. We can see that given the form of the Box-Cox transformation, the Jacobian j lambda y, we could obtain the profile log likelihood for only lambda. So, in the log likelihood, when we replace the unknown parameters beta and sigma square by their maximum likelihood estimates, we now have an equation which involves only one unknown, which is lambda. Then the likelihood equation is of the form C minus n divided by 2 times log sigma hat square lambda plus lambda minus 1 summation I equals 1 to n log yi, where C is a constant. If we assume that the geometric mean of the response vector is given by product I equals 1 to n yi whole raised to the power of 1 over n, and we also assume that y lambda g equals y lambda divided by g raised to the power of lambda minus 1, then we can clearly see that the likelihood function can be written as c minus n divided by 2 times log s square subscript lambda, where s square subscript lambda is the residual sum of squares divided by the sample size n from fitting the linear model y lambda g, which follows normal distribution with mean x beta and variance sigma square I n. So, in order to maximize the log likelihood, all we have to do is find a lambda or find transformation parameter lambda that minimizes s square subscript lambda, which equals y times lambda g I n minus g times y lambda g divided by n. The confidence interval for lambda, we can easily obtain the confidence interval for lambda by inverting the likelihood ratio test. If lambda hat is the MLE of parameter lambda, then approximately 100 times 1 minus alpha percent confidence interval for lambda will be given by lambda given sample size n times log of sum of square error lambda divided by sum of square error lambda hat. This is less than equals chi square 1 minus alpha, where sum of square error lambda equals y lambda g prime I n minus g times y lambda g. Now, we have seen how we can transform a response variable using the Box-Cox transformation, how we can obtain the estimates of the parameters beta and sigma square, and how we can obtain the estimate of the transformation parameter lambda. And we have also looked at the confidence interval for lambda. But after performing the Box-Cox transformation, there are a couple of questions that we might want to ask ourselves. Does the Box-Cox transformation always work? The Box-Cox transformation is not a guarantee for normality, because the Box-Cox transformation does not really check for normality. The method checks for the standard deviation, which is the smallest. The usual assumption that is made is that among all the transformations of the parameter lambda, values between minus 5 and plus 5 is what the value of the parameter lambda is. The likelihood of the transformed data is maximum, and the data are normally distributed when the standard deviation is the smallest. So, it is always advisable to check the transformed data for normality using the probability plot or the quantile plot. So, the summary of what we have learned from this module is that the idea is to introduce Box-Cox transformation procedure of data as a potentially better practice of transforming data rather than using the regular square root or log inverse or any other power transformation. And also, the Box-Cox transformation gives us a range of power transformations depending on the value of the transformation parameter lambda rather than the classical square root or log or inverse transformation, which is not as flexible as the Box-Cox transformation. So, here in the last couple of slides, I have demonstrated how we can use the Box-Cox transformation function in R to perform the Box-Cox transformation on a set of data. I have used the data set trees, which is an inbuilt data set in R. Here the three variables are girth, height and volume of trees. I wish to fit a model where the dependent variable is volume and the independent variables are girth and height. So, here we can see using the Box-Cox function in R, which is present in the package mask, I have fitted the model with dependent variable volume regressed on log of height and log of girth, and I have provided a sequence of lambda values which lie between minus 0.25 and plus 0.25, and it takes a length of sequence 10. So, for each of these lambda values between minus 0.25 and plus 0.25, for each lambda value we transform the data using that particular value of lambda and we obtain the log likelihood. And as you can see in the graph here, we have plotted the log likelihood, and we can see that the log likelihood is maximum for a value of lambda, which is somewhat around negative 0.07 or negative 0.08. So the plot here, when you perform the Box-Cox function in R, it gives us this graph which plots the log likelihood, and from the graph we can read the value of the transformation parameter lambda, which maximizes the log likelihood. When the assumption of normality of errors in a linear model is violated, we then look for methods of transforming the data so that it might now help us find normal error terms or error terms which are normally distributed, which is the assumption of linear models. In this module, we have learned the Box-Cox transformation method, which is one of the foremost methods used in order to transform data so that the error terms are now normally distributed. Also, this transformation helps us when the relationship between the dependent and independent variables are not linear. Now, in addition to Box-Cox transformation, we have also looked at the square root transformation, the inverse transformation and the log transformation. But as we will see using an example in a separate module, that the Box-Cox transformation is better than these regular types of transformation.